Okay, Nate, you can do this. Yes, everything is going wrong and things are stressful, but you're a behavior consultant. You spend most of your days telling people how to handle stress. This is a brain thing, right? Ugh, hearing that frequently probably gets annoying. Okay, you got this. This is a computer not doing what you want it to do. There has to be a way. Just think. Wait, breathe first. Okay. Now, maybe try converting this title into a compound clip and then trimming it to make the animation speed work. There we go. Wait, what is it doing? Is it frozen? Don't panic, Nate. Just wait a few seconds. Has it been a few seconds? Will clicking frantically help? What? No. Oh, the program crashed.
So, different situations demand certain cognitive skills of us, and if you don't have the underlying skills that are needed, or if something's preventing you from accessing them in the moment that you need them, then something's going to result. And frequently what results is a clash, or some kind of escalation, or what's frequently characterized as a challenging behavior. So then the question becomes, how can we take these skills into consideration both proactively and in the moment in a way that's individualized for each person's specific cognitive skill set? And that is where cognitive supports come into play. Cognitive supports are a model that I've developed to help me figure out what's going on with certain clients. It started off by being just about challenging behaviors, but really it's about much more than that. It's about understanding their brains and helping them learn in a way that actually makes sense. Honestly, we haven't done very good in the developmental disability field in a lot of aspects because a lot of us give up teaching certain skills after a certain period of time. But maybe if we can think about the person's brain more specifically, we can do more to meet them where they're at and then allow them to build up. You see, right now there's issues with a lot of the approaches that are out there. When we think of FASD, there haven't been very many therapeutic techniques specifically studied for them. So the kids with FASD, who we know are conservatively 5% of the population, are put into mental health programs for things that were not developed for their brain. CBT, DBT, none of these things were created with FASDs in mind. I consider cognitive supports to be a combination of certain values and current approaches that are already out there, and it allows us to customize each support with somebody's cognitive skills in mind. So I want to tell you what some of those values and approaches are so you can continue to research them going forward. The first is neurodiversity. Essentially, that's saying there's nothing wrong with having a brain that works differently than most people's. And just like any other aspect of a person that might require me or society to accommodate, such as a physical disability, that we should take as many steps as possible to not stigmatize and provide supports to people whose brains work differently. You can read a lot about neurodiversity online. I'll put a list of some links in the description below if you're interested. I feel like neurodiversity is really important because it's easy for me as somebody who does not struggle with the same issues or who just doesn't have the same brain as somebody else to impose my beliefs and my approaches on them. And if I struggle with empathy for whatever reason, then I may miss a lot of the things that I do unintentionally that can cause distress to somebody like that, or that just doesn't help them. To me, the power struggles we have with our kids with FASDs are ultimately due to two different types of brains trying to work together. And because we're the adult and they're the kid, a lot of it's going to be on us to provide supports until they can get to the place where their skills will help them move forward. It's also really important that you read the perspectives of people who are actually affected by whatever your child is affected by. For example, if they're autistic, read a bunch of autistic authors. If they have an FASD, look at the FASD authors who are out there, and not just professionals. I'm a professional who does not have an FASD, who's not autistic. I do have ADHD, which I'll talk about later, but I can't speak for the experience of a bunch of other people. And so it's important that everything we do is informed not only by what they've told us, but by their ongoing approval. And so that means an ongoing conversation with people with disabilities is needed. And sometimes we're going to have to be corrected by them and adjust our approaches in a way that they tell us will be better for people like them. I'll put a link to some of my favorite advocates, not only with FASDs, but also with various other developmental disabilities. Starting there is a good place to understanding how your kid's brain works and maybe better ways to work with them. One thing I will say is if you go to certain spaces online and ask a bunch of kind of newbie questions, the reception may not always be good. It's really common that well-intentioned people go into autistic spaces or disability spaces and ask a lot of basic questions, and that tends to annoy most of the people there, and they're going to tell you. So I'm warning you now, do not go in and ask basic questions. It's best just to go and read for a few months and kind of see how the space works. And with that, I'm going to talk about the next big influence in the cognitive support model, and that is collaborative and proactive solutions by Dr. Ross Greene. Maybe you've read one of his books. I'll put a link to a bunch of them down below. I'm not going to go into too many details now, but what CPS allowed me to do was first realize that challenging behaviors are not necessarily the result of willful misbehavior, but maybe the result of not having certain skills demanded. And two, the value of working directly with somebody and to try to figure out what's going on rather than just imposing your will on them. The concepts of CPS were introduced to me essentially the moment I started working with developmental disabilities, and that was really significant because that's what kind of filtered my whole view on everything moving forward. This idea that children and adults will do well if they can. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't generally not want to do well and choose not to do well. I mess up a lot, but I generally think the best about myself. And so what CPS introduced me to was if we can relate a lot of these things to specific cognitive skill issues, it's no longer an issue of character, but an issue of the brain. And because people want to do well, we can get their buy-in to move forward together. And in doing so, we can find out how their brains work and find concerns that they had that we didn't even think of. It helps us to find connection. So instead of responding to behaviors with punishments and trying to use bribes and reward systems, we can talk with the person specifically about what's going on. So I began to work on CPS principles for children with developmental disabilities, but there were some issues implementing it. Essentially, we were not considering the child's specific cognitive skills from the beginning of the problem-solving process all the way until the end. So we couldn't just have a verbal conversation, we had to do it in a way that worked for the developmental disability skill set. And as a note, everybody with a developmental disability will have a different skill set, and they are not all deficits. There's a lot of strengths and a lot of differences that we may not even consider. Just because somebody thinks differently doesn't necessarily mean that they think incorrectly or in a less valuable way. The third big influence on the cognitive support model is Diane Malbin's book, Trying Differently Rather Than Harder, and really her whole approach, which is called the neurobehavioral approach. We can't have a relationship with a child where we demand that they look normal or they act typical. This is a must-read book if you have a child with an FASD because it helps you understand what your expectations might need to be. This has also been studied. And what the study shows when parents follow the neurobehavioral model is that 1, they feel better about their parenting, and 2, they're much more likely to think proactively. And thinking proactively is a big step because oftentimes we're just trying to get through moment to moment, but that has to change if we're going to provide good cognitive supports. And I linked Diane Malbin's book to the concept of neurodiversity. That is, there are going to be some limits to a person's brain, maybe because of prenatal exposure to alcohol, and that's okay. Just like anybody else with a disability, we're going to provide appropriate accommodation. That is easier said than done, and we're going to continue to talk about the various situations that people with FASDs may face that make finding the needed supports difficult. But now, let's go over the different aspects of cognitive supports. This whole model is based upon parents understanding specific cognitive skills that their child struggles with and how those struggles influence their behavior in certain situations. In order to do this first step effectively, you have to devote time and attention to learning about not only cognitive skills, but other factors that might influence the person's behavior. Cognitive supports take time and they don't always work. The whole idea is that we're going to meet a person where they're at. We're going to adjust our demands and provide cognitive supports based upon their individual skill set, and then hopefully over time they will begin to build skills. I think this is important because especially among people with developmental disabilities, there's an idea that they can't learn, even into adulthood, and I don't think that's true. I think the issue is that we try ideas that aren't based on anything specific, just on things that we've tried in the past. So we hand out visuals, but we don't think about what does that visual demand of the person's cognitive skills, and do they have the skills to use that visual? Or we put them on a routine, but they continue to escalate because we're not thinking about what cognitive skills it takes in order to transition from one part of the routine to another. So we think they're resisting the whole routine, but maybe they're resisting the way that you, caregiver, are transitioning them. The next big part is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, thinking proactively, or what I call thinking ahead. In order for you to use cognitive supports in your everyday life, you have to take time every day to stop and ask yourself, what are my expectations today? What is planned today? And what is my kid's ability to do this? And if they don't have good abilities on their own, that's when you should be thinking, which cognitive supports will they need in place? By thinking ahead in these ways and kind of figuring out the situations that may happen, we can then continue the cognitive support process and think about supports that will help either proactively before there's a situation or in the moment. That leads us to the third part of cognitive supports, which is about adjusting our expectations. I find it really interesting in talking about this how a lot of people's first immediate concern is that by adjusting expectations of somebody with a developmental disability, that you're teaching them that they can get away with some kind of behavior. That's a very traditional view, but that's not how we really view behavior today. And in fact, if you listen to people with developmental disabilities, they'll make it pretty clear that ongoing stress, being put in situations that they couldn't cope with by adults who didn't understand how their brain works, was not an effective way for them to learn skills. This really shouldn't be that controversial when we think about what we know about how stress and trauma impact children, teenagers, and adults' development. It influences our cognitive skills directly, and ongoing stress in the form of unreasonable expectations could be traumatic. Adjusting expectations means that we take whatever we expect and put it through a filter of, is it reasonable for this person? And if it's not, then we have to figure out how to adjust. If I'm going to take a kid into a busy environment and there's nothing I can do to stop that and nothing I can do to stop the noise in the environment, then it would be unreasonable of me to expect them to focus and do something that is intense in that moment. So instead, I might take them into the environment and let them play with a toy, or just be okay with their attention going from one thing to another as long as it doesn't cause stress. That doesn't mean that I'm letting the person get away with not paying attention. It means I'm taking into account many different factors and that person's specific cognitive skill abilities. Adjusting expectations may mean that we hold the person with FASD to a different standard than other people when it comes to challenging behaviors. If I view cursing not as disrespect, but as an impulsive reaction to sudden stress, then it makes sense to me to not really worry about cursing. Why? Because people with FASDs struggle with impulsivity, and they're sure as hell gonna struggle with it when they're under stress. So why be annoyed that they're cursing when that's actually being used for them in that moment as an emotional regulation strategy? Now, yes, the goal might be to help them come up with a better emotional regulation strategy, but if we make it about the fact that they shouldn't curse, that's not going to give them any tools. That's just telling them, you gotta try harder not to curse because we don't like it. That will mean that sometimes you're questioning, am I teaching this person bad behavior? That is a normal feeling to have. It will mean that you will sometimes feel like you are bending over backwards just to prevent a tiny amount of stress. That is normal to feel, and in a lot of ways you are. Because the logic is, it's in those moments where there's no stress and there's a connection that skills can slowly be built up. When that happens, we might be able to raise our expectations back up. But we're doing it under this idea that they need the skills to be successful, not that they just need to meet our expectations because we want them to. And we're doing it considering the person's individual brain. We're being as individualized as we can possibly get. The fourth part of the cognitive supports process is probably where most of our attention will ultimately be, and that is on how we can adjust our approach to situations or change the physical environment around the person to help support skills building. These can include things that seem really simple at first, but are really very, very difficult to implement in everyday life. One of the things that I think is ironic in a funny way is that the same reason it's very difficult for me or for you to give somebody quiet time to think after we ask them a question is the same reason why people with developmental disabilities may struggle with our expectations. We're demanding something of the brain that it's just not used to doing. We're demanding that it think in a way that it hasn't learned to yet. So what happens is we say, yeah, I know I need to give my kid time to think, but in the everyday moments we just forget. We are caught up in the moment forgetting this person needs a cognitive support. There are literally countless ways that we can do this part of the cognitive support process, and so we'll leave that to future episodes. And the last part of the cognitive supports process is planning together. Now, this will probably be the last thing that you'll focus on as you begin using the model, but it could potentially be the most effective way to work with somebody who has challenging behaviors or cognitive skill deficits. The goal is to continue to build connection and build skills by being proactive and working with the person directly, getting their input, getting their ideas, and practicing those ideas, and we can work together to build the skills or reduce the behaviors that we're targeting. Planning together, having just a typical conversation doesn't work. You already know that. So what we have to do is support the very conversations themselves with various cognitive supports. And that's what I'm going to teach you to continue to do throughout the series. Now, maybe you're thinking about a person who doesn't have the skills to sit down and have any type of proactive planning conversation yet. That's okay. We can try to continue the planning process by putting in some kind of cognitive supports, maybe for communication or thinking abstractly, which we're kind of demanding whenever we want to plan together with them. Let's say a person will not be able to speak or communicate at all. That's okay. You can still follow parts of the cognitive support process. They're still going to need you to understand all the various aspects of their life, preferably by listening to people who share a lot of those aspects. They're going to need you to help prevent stressful situations by thinking ahead and asking yourself, what are you demanding of them and what are their abilities in that area? They're going to need you to adjust expectations, which may or may not be easy depending on the situation. That's why you want to continue to use the cognitive skills filter so you can look at what's going wrong in certain situations. And of course, they're going to need you to continually adjust your approach and the physical environment to, again, prevent stress and help to increase their quality of life. These steps in cognitive supports aren't a one-time thing. They're a cycle. We do them over and over and over again, and we might have to constantly reassess the same situation until we find something that works for everybody. Cognitive supports are not easy fixes, and I'm not claiming that these will help build skills. This isn't some kind of neuroplasticity training kind of a thing, which you should be skeptical about. Instead, this approach seeks to honor a person where their brain is at and realize that there is value to that and help that person thrive in our society, where instead of judging them, hopefully we can begin to accommodate them. As we continue to talk about strategies, you're going to see these icons pop up from here to there to remind you which part of the process they help you with. And ultimately, this whole series is meant to help you with your understanding, which is, of course, the first part of the cognitive support process. And I hope, most of all, that it helps you to connect with somebody who maybe you struggled to connect with before or who you didn't know you could connect with before. That is ultimately the best way to reach somebody. Connect with them in a way that works for them. So in addition to thinking about cognitive skills individually, we can also think about certain things that require multiple skills at once. And even some skills are made up of smaller skills. And a notable one is emotional regulation. We cover emotional regulation on skill number 22 of the OBC Cognitive Skills and Tasks list, or I like to just call it the OXT, even though that's not particularly easier to say. Now, there are several different ways that we achieve emotional regulation in our brain, and I'm not going to talk about the specifics of that in this episode, but I do want to talk about a concept that's really, really important to understanding how to work with people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders or really with any executive functioning issues. So we're going to use emotional regulation as an example with this model of a brain. This is, of course, a game of Mousetrap, and like most of you as a kid, I never actually played the game that is laid out on the board. We just put it together and played with it. And today we're going to do that to illustrate how things can go wrong in trying to achieve emotional regulation. One of the things that I think is interesting about emotional regulation is that there's no devoted structure for it. Instead, emotional regulation is the result of a bunch of underlying cognitive skills clicking together for a person in the moment of a stressor. And those skills are the ones that you've heard of, things like attention, impulse control, ignoring distractions, problem solving, transitioning. All of those happen in a certain way in the moment of a stressor to help us stay calm and hopefully do what we need to do. Or they don't click in and we don't stay calm and other behaviors can happen as a result. So let's think about the Mousetrap board here as a process that will be needed in order to achieve emotional regulation. We will know that emotional regulation is achieved if we can catch the mouse at the very end. Every structure here can be seen as a different cognitive skill. Maybe this ramp represents attention and the ability to ignore distractions. And remembering what the plan is can be represented by this, right? Every piece will be an underlying skill. And hopefully, if everything is going okay for you, and there's nothing else interfering, then if a stressor happens very quickly, we can have emotional regulation achieved. Let's take a look. There you go.
Emotional regulation achieved.
Now, it doesn't take much for something to go wrong, especially when there are factors in play that really stunt somebody's ability to use whatever executive functioning skills they have. Maybe they're a kid, so they don't have developed executive functioning skills, and remember, those skills are needed to achieve emotional regulation. Also, I want to point out, this is all applicable to every one of us. Nobody has perfect emotional regulation, and our ability to regulate our emotions is going to differ from day to day. We're going to talk a lot more about emotional regulation and specifically what it is in future episodes. Or maybe there's something like FASD, which impacts the development of executive functioning skills and your ability to access them once they're developed. So what if I remove one piece? I'm going to remove the rubber band and see how that impacts somebody's emotional regulation. So there's a stressor and immediately nothing can happen. I've taken away a piece that's needed for the very beginning of emotional regulation. Okay, so I'll put that back. What if I didn't have the bucket here ready to catch the process? So I can maybe start off fine, get going, but then something happens and it interferes. What does this mean for us when it comes to providing cognitive supports? Well, we need to support the underlying skills as they continue to develop, and in the moment we have to have some kind of plan ready because these skills will not be accessible. When we have a plan ready, we can do some pre-thinking, and that will make it a lot easier in the moment, not just for our kid, but for us to stay emotionally regulated. So essentially what a plan allows us and our kid to do is skip certain parts of regulation that are typically needed and achieve emotional regulation in a completely different way. Now, let's get real. I can be a bit of a hothead, so I really try hard to not allow myself to get to that point. And because I spend a lot of time talking about these concepts, not just in these videos, but in my everyday work, about having a plan so that way you can emotionally regulate, I don't really have to do it very frequently. I don't see a lot of my clients actually engaging in behaviors when I meet them, so I don't see those high-level escalation situations very often, even though I talk about them all the time. But I do have a plan in my head ready to go that I rehearse, because that's what I recommend everybody do. So I try to do that as well, and oftentimes just talking about it, I'm rehearsing what my plan is in my head. So a couple of years ago, I am at a home visit, and I'm meeting with a parent for the first time, and this was not a typical case for me to be accepting because it was not fetal alcohol, but I did it as a favor to a member of this kid's team. We're having a conversation, I'm doing my interview that I typically do, and all of a sudden this kid's mom just starts yelling and screaming at me. That's not something I encounter very often, right? Especially on the very first visit, that's not usually when things would go that way. So I actually had the conscious thought, well, Nate, now you get to practice what you preach all the time. And that thought was my prompt to follow my plan. And there's almost something supernatural coming, up to you, right? And it kind of blocks you away from the situation. And in this case, it's essentially the realization that I am now following a plan, right? This is the situation I have prepared for. I need to not think on my feet in a lot of ways. Of course, it will depend on what's going on, but I need to do what I have agreed with myself to do, potentially with other people to do. And one of the things that's really good to know is figuring out when you're escalated. And it's sometimes easy, sometimes not for me. But in this situation, it was easy because I immediately had the thought that, oh, this is not good, right? So I need to practice what I preach. So for me, a sign that I'm escalated is that I am very aware of my heart beating. And I also get kind of this hotness in my head. I knew in that moment, because I was no longer engaging there, right? And this is all happening in seconds. But I knew in the moment that I needed to not say anything until I was no longer focused on how hard my heart was beating. By not arguing and not engaging, I'm letting her get it all out. And essentially, she was mad at me because I was explaining what my role is in my job. This is my interpretation, of course. And I kind of feel like she thought I was going to go into her house, have a few conversations with her kid, and then that's how the behaviors would start to improve. But as those of you who watch my videos know, that's not how it works. Almost all of the attention is on us and what we're doing and what we're changing and what we're considering, not on the person themselves, at least not at first, as we talked about when we talked about the cognitive support process. So she's able to get it all out. I'm sitting there realizing that I need to be taking my deep breaths and not responding and trying to separate myself from the escalation. And here's the thing, here's what I wanted to say. Listen, lady, I don't need you. I have a wait list. I have more clients than I know what to do with. I drove to a pain-in-the-butt part of Portland, where I do not live, to do a favor for a member of your team, and your son doesn't even have the disability that I work with. And that's what I wanted to say, right? That's what catty, sarcastic Nate would have said in the moment. And I do have good verbal abilities when I am pissed, and not in a productive way, but in a can cut somebody down kind of way. But it wasn't until I was able to separate and get in my car and start my pain-in-the-butt drive back where I live, I realized all of the factors that are in this woman's life. And I'm very good at assuming the best about my clients, but this wasn't a client situation. I left there pretty annoyed that this had happened. So now I'm sitting there thinking about all of the things in her life that contribute to behavior. And once you start to do that, a lot of these things make sense. And I'm not going to say specifically what the issues in her life were, but she had reason to be very, very stressed out about her son's behavior. And I also had to remember that I'm not the first social worker type coming into this woman's home and telling her, however nicely, that what she's doing isn't working. Up until that point, I had no connection with her. She didn't know about any of my work, nothing about my approach. So it kind of made sense that she would get hostile, in addition to a bunch of other factors. And so by being able to consider all of that, I could have a lens change on this woman in that particular situation. But it took me time, and this is somebody who talks about these principles constantly. It took me time, and then I kind of was like, yeah, it was not a big deal. I just kind of moved on, and we went from there. And what I think about is what would have happened had I just said what I wanted to say. First, there's a good chance that not only in the moment, but even now up to this day, that I would have justified what I did, right? From my perspective, I was defending myself. She was coming at me. I'm trying to help her. What is this woman's problem? So in addition to continuing to justify it and therefore not get the overall lesson that I ended up getting from that, I would have probably ruined a professional relationship with that woman, obviously. Maybe gotten a bad review. Responding to her that way would not have given her any skills other than to say, don't mess with Nate. It would not have helped her with her son. It wouldn't accomplish anything that I wanted to help her with. So it really wouldn't do much other than help me in the moment feel better. I would not have done that if I did not talk about the things that I talk about. If I did not have a specific plan that reminded me, this is a scenario, Nate, that you now need to step outside of and follow a plan for. None of that would have happened. And I don't think that me following the plan, which then allowed me to kind of get all those morals or conclusions from that situation that I ultimately got is a feel-good kind of a thing. I think that that is the more accurate way to look at somebody's behavior. It wasn't that this woman was a bitch, it was that she was under a lot of stress, just like the kids that I work with. And so I can forgive those kids. That means that I need to be able to apply the same logic to the adults that I work with, especially parents who are under a lot of stress. So now we're going to talk about how you can start to take practical steps for you, not for your kid, but for you to recognize when you're upset. There's different types of escalation, and even if you are lower intensity escalated towards your kid or your smart alecky teenager, that doesn't mean that you're doing well. So lower intensity does not necessarily mean that you have more reasoning abilities. It could mean that, but not necessarily. So we can still do unhelpful things even if we're just minorly escalated or minorly annoyed. First thing you want to do is identify, how do you know when you're escalated? And don't think about necessarily a situation that's unfolding in front of you, but maybe something that you found out about when you were alone. So you're by yourself and you get mad. What happens to your body? What do you feel? Kind of head to toe, and just sit for a second and think about that. For me, it is my heartbeat, like I mentioned before, the feeling of hotness, often the sinking in my stomach, and sometimes a lot of cursing happens. So figure out what your thing is and write it down. Find a piece of paper, just write down physical signs of escalation and what it is for you. So then you got to think about what your coping strategy will be, and that will help you to achieve emotional regulation. Deep breathing is a common one. Going on a walk, that will of course depend on the situation. And you're going to probably have a nice list of 7 or 8 things that you could do. So think of the micro in the moment, deep breath, right? Pacing, whatever it is you need to do. And think of the things that you might have time for depending on the situation, like going for a walk, going on a drive, that kind of a thing. We can take deep breaths. We can buy ourselves some time. Say something like, I need a minute to think. Right? That avoids telling them what to do. We can try to slow down the conversation. Just because we know an answer to one of their questions right away doesn't mean we have to give it right away. We can literally just pause a second and then give it. Or again, maybe say, let me think about that for a moment. Then you also want to practice, and we talk about practicing a lot. And you can do this when you're by yourself as well as when you're with other people. Now, to be a little vulnerable for me, that is sometimes when I am driving down the road. I love to drive, and people that live in Oregon are not exactly known for understanding basics about how lanes are supposed to work. So for me, it will depend on a bunch of factors in terms of how annoyed I get. If I can try to remember in those moments that I need to follow my plan, so I will identify what should I do when I specifically get annoyed with another driver. I can take a deep breath, I can say something sarcastic, or I can do a cognitive change. So think, well, maybe they didn't do that on purpose, or maybe they're oblivious, right? And it will depend in those moments what I'm going to choose. There's nothing wrong with saying something sarcastic because nobody's in the car with me, and it actually is a way for me to achieve emotional regulation.
Sarcasm is a way we can achieve emotional regulation. Sarcasm is a way that we can achieve emotional regulation.
So start practicing in the situations where you might be by yourself, and then start practicing for the situations with your kids. When they escalate, what should your immediate response be? We want to avoid having to think on our feet in that moment, even for low-level escalations with our kids. 100% of the time, we want to encourage stopping to think, getting de-escalated, and then moving forward in some kind of collaborative way. And this is all under the understanding that we're not going to make much progress, and we're probably going to do a lot more damage if we try to have a conversation right then and right there. Because we, as the parents or the professional, will forget all of the factors about the person if we're immediately escalated and can't remember, hold on, I need to go back to my plan. By not responding and following a plan that allows us to think, we can remember who the person is in front of us. They're not a brat, they're not an asshole, they are somebody who's struggling right now. And they're struggling for legitimate, brain-based reasons, whether it's a disability, a mental health issue, or their previous trauma. This allows us to go into a zone where instead of responding and thinking on our feet, we can figure out what it is we can do to help the person de-escalate as soon as possible and to connect with them. And that connection is going to be a lot more important than dealing with the issue a lot of the time. Okay, so there are some steps for you to get started on thinking about what you need to achieve emotional regulation in the moment. I also just want to emphasize that we've been talking about a lot of in-the-moment stuff today, but really, if we could be preventing a lot of these situations proactively, we won't even have to go there. And so that's what we'll continue to talk about in various different scenarios throughout the series.